From all my childhood voyages back to Ireland, only two things remembered. Gulls afloat off Fishguard Quay, littering a patch of radiance shed by the midnight boat. And at dawn, a low, dun coast shaping to meet me, an oyster sky opening above Rosslare. I rub the sleep from my eyes. Gulls pace the moving masthead. We're almost there. Gulls white as a dream on the pitch off Fishguard Harbour. Paper cutouts, birds on a lacquered screen, the low coastline and the pearl sky of Ireland, a long sleep in between. A sleep between two waking dreams. The haven, the landfall, is how it appears now. The child's eye, unpuzzled, saw plain facts. I catch a glint from the darkness they're haunted by.
You're listening to Wadcast, a podcast from Wadham College, University of Oxford, bringing you interviews, seminars and stories from our community.
Welcome to episode 3. The poem in our intro was Fishguard to Rosslare, written by C.D. Lewis. It was read by our Emeritus Fellow, Bernard O'Donoghue. In this episode, Bernard engages in a cross-generational appraisal of Lewis's poetry with Wadham undergraduate, Fox. Their discussion commemorates 50 years since Lewis's passing. I'll turn it over to Bernard and Fox.
And what are your first impressions of Lewis?
Well, it's hard when you read him, I think, not to immediately see him in terms of the people around him.
Yeah.
You know, part of that is just reading his Wikipedia for the first time and reading kind of father of Daniel Day-Lewis and friend of Auden. He has a lot of famous friends, and it's hard to detach his poetry from that of Auden, from that of the McSpawn group. And, you know, I'm curious actually, as someone who knows his work much more intimately, do you find that the McSpawn group is a useful context for you for his work, or are there elements of his production that you find are missed because that's been the primary critical lens on him for so long, him as a 30s poet, as a friend of Auden, as a member of this select circle? That's
a very interesting question. I suppose that the most significant part of that, and it's all true, is Auden, the Auden connection, really. Because they were called the Auden generation. You know, their Auden occurs in titles of critical works in several ways, really, and it's ironic in some ways because in terms of status, and as you would describe him, Day-Lewis's achievements were very significant, really. I mean, as poet laureate and Oxford professor, and he gave all the international big lectures. You know, he was constantly on lecture tours, a bit like Dickens, really. But he always seems to be, just as you say, he's always seen in the context of somebody else, really. I suppose even as a translator, that's perhaps true, isn't it?
Yes, that's
translator
true.
of Virgil is primarily Virgil, isn't it?
How much of it then do you think is something that he chose for himself? You know, when we were speaking earlier, you said, thought in some ways he's so conscious of genre. It's why he's such a good detective novelist.
Yeah.
Genre and form. And that's a kind of consciousness of a prehistory and a participation in it. How much do you think it was a chosen identity for him, this, you know, definition, secondariness, that's the word.
Yeah. I think it's perhaps not so much chosen as kind of as faced up to. I mean, I think he kind of genuinely underrated himself. And I mean, I don't know how I want to describe it, really. I'm not never entirely sure that he's sort of happy in his own role, really, in being what he is.
He's rather underrated now.
Yes.
Would you rate him higher?
Well, I think he has certainly taken at his own estimate. You know, estimation by now, really. in what way? I was just thinking, in what field one is likely to encounter him first, because I said he was a great translator of Virgil, which he is, but there are lots of great translators of Virgil in a way. Nobody is going to be. I mean, for instance, Seamus Heaney is a very sort of significant translator of Greek drama, but that wouldn't make his reputation on its own, I think being a major translator isn't going to make him sort of primary in that sort of way. So I think you're right. I mean, it's very hard to decide exactly what. In a way, he's not a wholly successful war poet either. Really, I mean, he's got that great line about the bad and the worse, but. There isn't much sort of active material in the way he talks about the war. You wouldn't get much sense of what the war was like. I mean, he was an air raid warden, that kind of thing. He was on the right side of things nearly all the time, really.
People say, and I found it too, when you read his war poetry and his more politically engaged poetry, it often seems to be his weakest, or you feel the lyric impulse rising to the surface in some way, maybe trying to take over. Would you place that lyric impulse and his kind of political career in tension? And if so, a productive tension, a dynamic tension, what's there?
That's a really interesting point. I think that's the essence of it, really. I mean, one of his books is called The Poetic Image, and it's just a kind of endless kind of feeling around for what for imagery and poetry kind of working as poetry, rather than what
critical books.
Yes, yeah, but I think you're right. The conflict between the lyric impulse, is a phrase he used, in fact, and the requirement to be political is absolutely central, really. I suppose the other context in which he is seen, like all that group, is Auden and Yeats. Auden saying poetry makes nothing happen.
Yes.
So.
And of course, he withdrew from politics.
Yes.
Quite defeated, maybe even in the 60s.
That's right.
Finally.
Yeah. Yes.
Do you think it changed his poetry significantly? The removal of that commitment.
Yes, I think it did. I think it was not exactly damaging, but I think it made it more single-stranded, rather than so that the toughness that occasionally came in with consideration of political things is lost a bit, I think. Of course, it's been a big debate, hasn't it, in the 20th century poetry discussion, whether poetry can make things happen, or whether poetry should be, or should ignore the political world altogether. I mean, it's a big, huge question, really. And people do have quite strong views about it, I think. I think Day-Lewis says that, and MacNeice says it too, that they talked about impure poetry. That is to say, you can't just settle for poetry being pleased with itself and being lyrical and being poetry and nothing else. It has to do more than that, So impure poetry is poetry that kind of, descends to the everyday sort of thing. So I think he was aware of that dilemma, really.
Yes, and although he lived until 1975, was it 76?
Yeah, true.
He lived until the mid-1970s.
Yeah.
He's still really spoken of as a 30s poet.
Yes.
And that's that's still a period that defines him and defines his reputation. This sort of intensely politically charged period where he was trying hard to write politically charged poetry.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. I think in a way that the person of the four was, if there's another of them who was less mentioned, it's Spender, isn't it? I mean, Spender is also, he lived for a long time. He lived till 1995, so he had a kind of afterlife compared to the others. But his reputation is slightly faded as well, isn't it?
Yes, both of them have sunk into the sort of bottom half of the McSpawn-Day acronym.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
And you say as you walked round, Auden is clearly the superior poet.
Yeah.
What about in comparison with MacNeice? Would you give C.D. Lewis a shot at the second spot?
Well, that's a very good question. Yeah, I think most people wouldn't. I mean, but and the last point you made about the lyrical versus the political is exactly the point. Because MacNeice is really wonderful lyric poet. I mean, he writes wonderful short lyrics, as good as anybody really. He's a terrific lyric poet. But he also wrote this very long poem called Autumn Journal, which is about political circumstances in the early 1940s, and it's a very kind of savage denunciation of Ireland's neutrality in the war, and talks about the British Navy protecting the shores of Ireland, which is a very committed position, and said with great kind of confidence. So MacNeice has he has a lot of arrows to fire really, and being public and lyrical. So I think the general view will be that MacNeice is in the silver medal spot really, I think. But then there are lots of things that Day-Lewis does that MacNeice doesn't. In terms of, just nobody writes about anything else. I mean, the translations and then I suppose the detective novels.
Yes, he had so many strands to his career. We were speaking before kind of the interview began about how when you Google him, actually some of the first things that come up are kind of the man behind these amazing children's books.
Yes.
You see him on kind of mummy blogs and parent sites even, and he can be found in these amazingly kind of diverse roles, sometimes that are hard to fit together.
That's very interesting.
The writer of detective fiction, the writer of children's books, the writer of 3 serious and quite unsuccessful novels, of political poetry, of lyric poetry, a latter-day Georgian, and an affiliate of this kind of group. How would you, and of course a translator, as you said before, would you say that his detective fiction, one of the kind of particularly enigmatic and exciting parts of his career and reputation, has any conversation with his poetry, with his lyric poetry?
Right. He's the first person, I think, that question arises with, and there have been several since. I mean, the most awesome was John Banville, the Irish novelist, who's also a writer of detective fiction and of crime fiction, I think. So I think Day-Lewis sort of did that first. He did that double role first, certainly with a change of name like that. But
yes, part of the excitement of him as a detective writer must be the nom de plume, the kind of second identity that it gives him.
Yes. Interesting question. I mean, I don't know the detective novels well enough to say, but interesting if the sense of the personality of a writer, if there is such a thing, feels different in those books.
And as we've been speaking about C.D. Lewis, you've been locating him often in relation to other Irish poets.
Yes.
And this is a major question of his kind of life and of his career. To what extent do you think can he be considered an Irish poet?
Yeah, I mean that's a crucial question as well, and a question they're very aware of. I mean that Jill Balkan's children, the children of the second marriage, Tamsin Day-Lewis and Daniel, are great Irophiles. They both live in Ireland. Daniel Lewis lives in Wicklow, and Townsend Day Lewis is in Mayo a lot of the time, the far west. So that they're very keen on the notion of Irishness. That's something else he doesn't exactly invent, but the tone of liking Ireland. There's a famous line in Autumn Journal, in MacNeil's Autumn Journal, when he says, "Why do we like being Irish?" In the context of a long poem in English written in London and published in London. What exactly? Then supporters of the Irish rugby team, that kind of thing. There's a notion of kind of commitment to Irishness.
And is that something that you think often makes its way into C.D. Lewis's poetry, that bid for connection either with Ireland as a place, Irish cultural traditions, or with Irish literary traditions? Because obviously, he's writing in the shadow of Yeats.
Right. Yeah.
How much is he making a claim for that as an inheritance, do you think?
Right, that's another major question. Yeah, I think he's not exactly. I mean, I think he wrote a very good essay on Yeats, and he's a great admirer of Yeats. But one of the other ways of undervaluing him, I think, rather unfairly, is to think of him as being a Georgian poet to begin with. So when he's writing poetry first in the 20s, it is what you said about the kind of the lyric impulse and the wish to write, likeable. Short poems. That's what he does, and it's. I think his first book of poems published in 1925. Which is 3 years after The Wasteland. So there's that. There's this huge change in poetic practice and what poetry was about, which she's hardly touched by at all, really. I mean, there's several ways of placing poets then out there. I think one is. The modernist, like the Wasteland, as distinct from the political, and the Wasteland isn't exactly unpolitical, but I mean, or the kind of Georgian simple lyrical. And Day Lewis is certainly not modernist. He's very slow to develop connections with modernism, I think, if he ever does, really. I expect that he's a formalist rather than modernist, maybe. And Yeats is such an impossibly superior figure. I mean, I think somebody said about him that Yeats kind of sucks up all the kind of poetic moisture around him, so the trees all around him die, I think, because Yeats has somehow done it all, really. And I think Day Lewis didn't try to cope with the legacy of Yeats, really. As some of them did, people like Austin Clarke and MacNeil to some extent, I think, sees Yeats as a predecessor. I mean, of course, and Auden writes such the great poem about Yeats. But I think Day Lewis is very keen on the atmosphere, the sort of ambience of Ireland and Irishness and so on, but. Not so much in Irish traditions, I think.
Mockery spring, to lend this bridal gear for a few hours to a raw country maid, then leave her all disconsolate with old fairings of anknite and snowdrop. No. Not here, amid this flounce and filigree of death, is the real transformation scene in progress. But deep below, where frost, worrying the stiff clods, unclenches their grip on the seeds and lets the future breathe. If he's not fully an Irish poet, would you say he can be productively defined as a poet who occupies a peripheral place or who's interested in peripheral statuses, liminal statuses? Absolutely.
And I think that all the things that we've been saying, fit in with that, don't they? And I mean, one of the things that we didn't talk about earlier on, going round, was he and Jill Balkin and his wife were very celebrated readers of poetry on the BBC. They were the first go-to people for reading poetry on the BBC in the 60s, 50s.
Amazing.
Yeah,
Celebrity quality that followed him.
Yes. But and of course he reads with an extraordinary patrician voice. I mean, Macnice sounded very patrician as well, really. So the liking being Irish, I think implicit in that is not being Irish. It's something that you like, something you choose, rather than something that you are. And I think calling it peripheral is exactly right, really. And I think he perhaps didn't like it. He said he'd choose peripheralism. It just
it happened.
It just happened. It's just where he was, really. He had quite difficult relations with his father. His father was quite strict, I think.
Smother love as well, though, is that amazing phrase
yes.
from The Buried Day. So
that's right.
Strict, but also too much
yes.
at the same time. And,
yes.
That, I think, can be immediately linked to the death of his mother.
Yes.
This kind of seminal tragedy.
Yeah.
I'm interested in how you think the death of his mother, I mean, it's maybe a shallow kind of autobiographical reading, but does the death of his mother come back in his poetry? Or the relationship with his father? How would you kind of...
Yeah. One of the interesting sidelines with that is that his father, of course, had parishes in various parts of England as well as in Wexford. And when he was a student, when Deleuze was at Wadham, he stayed during the vacations with his father, who was in a parish in Nottinghamshire, quite near D.H. Lawrence country, which is an interesting kind of deep contrast as well, really. So the letters to Barbara, most of them are written from Edwinstowe in Nottinghamshire, But he says that he was very... he said that his strong left-wing and anti-discriminatory views, all that come with the experience of Nottinghamshire. But he also says that he thought he genetically inherited it from his mother, which is interesting to say about his father implicitly as well, maybe,
Yes,
but,
that's true.
Yeah, because he was...
and this idea of genetic inheritance, it's a faith, isn't it, in a way?
Yeah,
someone who he perhaps couldn't completely remember,
yes.
or even couldn't remember at all,
Yes.
A genetic inheritance is a kind of connection that you can't necessarily see.
Absolutely, yeah. Especially with the kind of gender implications of it too, maybe, which is interesting for both him and Macnice, I think.
And you mentioned that his father was a priest. He had parishes in Ireland, across England.
Yeah.
Do you think religion was an important question or problem for Lewis?
That's a very good question too. Yeah, I think maybe not. Oddly enough, I mean,
a little bit of God in his poems.
There is. That's true. But there's this. I think there's a bit of reaction against organised active religion, really, as there is in Macnice, about his father wearing his collar back to front. The idea that there's something abnormal about religious commitment. Really, I think they were both in reaction against it. Both reacting against it towards the classics as well. I think they're both kind of classicists.
And, Day-Lewis, he writes about having an almost religious faith in poetry.
Yes.
There's a kind of, perhaps a clear substitution there for him, or an easy substitution.
Absolutely. And I think that might even be a way in which he has been a bit influential on people like Shemasini, makes great claims for poetry as, for its own dispensation, being a kind of a world of its own. The government of the tongue, the government by language and poetry, as distinct from religious domination. I think Lewis was a major preacher of that, but I think it perhaps did catch on a bit. I think it did influence other people. And I think there is a kind of Irish tradition leading on to Heaney as well.
That's true. Even aside from kind of the Irish tradition he may have placed himself in, you know, he's been placed into an Irish tradition by other people subsequently.
Yes.
And that's been an important part of his reception. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about who he's been to the people who've come after him.
Yes. I think, again, we're going to hit the same kind of problem in a way, in that I think he wasn't exactly influential. Perhaps what he represented wasn't clear enough, I think, for somebody to go and do likewise. I think it was quite difficult. Heaney does talk about him, but only kind of passingly, and Heaney is very strong on MacNeice, which is a major predecessor. I suppose there's also the question of Protestantism, Catholicism, you know, the divisions in Ireland, which don't play in De Lewis much, really. I think the point about Irishness being an ambience rather than anything it actually was comes in there again, really. His father's background is quite interesting. I mean, that's where the De Lewis comes from, because one of those names is his birth father, and the other is his stepfather. The De and the Lewis are come about in that way. So, and C.D. Lewis is quite interesting on that, because he says he had affected to not write his De Lewis name with the hyphen, as a kind of street cred thing, you know.
Yeah.
And he said it just caused confusion, really.
A problem for librarians.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. I mean, again, it's a bit like being uncertain about his standing in a way.
That's true. It's interesting that even in his own name, he generated multiple names for himself.
Yeah, he did.
It wasn't just his nom de plume as a detective writer.
No.
You've got the kind of bifurcated identity, even in the De Lewis.
Yes, and it's right, and the C as well, because he perhaps that's the reason, but he didn't like the name Cecil, so he tried to avoid it as much as possible.
Bowra did that too, no?
He did?
Bowra's first name, Cecil Maurice Bowra, but
yes.
You rarely hear about the Cecil.
That's C.M. Bowra, yeah.
It's been ditched along the wayside.
That's right, yeah, that's right.
And maybe we could talk some more about who he was to Cecil De Lewis, because he was a very important figure through his life. Bowra.
Absolutely, hugely, yeah. I mean, Bowra, just based on the letters and the general sort of exchanges between them, Bowra is comes across very attractively, I think, really. You know, he's sort of bon viveur and all that, isn't he? But there's a great kind of warmth about Bowra in relation to him. There's a very nice name story, actually, about when towards the end of they both died more or less at the same time, really. De Lewis died in 72 and Bowra 73, I think. But they were going, I think, out for dinner by taxi from the front of Wadham, and the young De Lewises were in the taxi when Bowra got in, and Daniel De Lewis, on whom be blessings, you know, age 4, turned round to Bowra and said, "What's your name?" And Bowra said, "Morris. Morris is my name." It's a very little story, you know, but Bowra, it seems very unpompous, actually, for somebody with a great kind of booming presence. Well, it's very nice to have a perceptive and receptive new young reader for De Lewis.
It's been very nice to read him.
Yeah, well, it's been...
And very, very interesting to speak to you about him. I've really learnt a lot. Thank you so much.
So have I. I mean, wonderful questions, and I think absolutely at the heart of what De Lewis is about.